The boy stood behind the curtain, holding his hands together as if he was trying to keep them warm. The room backstage was small and crowded with other kids waiting for their turn, but he stayed in one corner, quiet and unnoticed. He didn't try to talk to anyone, and no one tried to talk to him either. His clothes looked older than the rest, the kind that had been washed so many times the colors began to fade. His shoes had a small tear on one side, and he hoped no one would look down long enough to notice it. He kept his eyes on the floor, not because he was shy by nature, but because life had taught him that keeping your head low kept trouble away. He could hear the sound of the audience from outside. People talking, laughing, and every now and then someone clapping. The talent show had been going on for almost an hour, and he could feel his stomach twisting more with every performance he missed. He knew the judges didn't expect much from the last contestants. Most of the good performers had already gone. The ones with fancy clothes, rehearsed smiles, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing someone always had their back. He tightened his grip around the thin music sheet he carried, even though he didn't need it. He had memorized every single note years ago. Still, holding the paper made him feel like he wasn't empty-handed, like he belonged there. A volunteer called out numbers one by one. When she called his number, she paused for a moment as if trying to match the paper to the boy she saw standing alone. Then she smiled, but it wasn't the warm kind. It was the polite kind people use when they weren't sure what to expect. "You're next," she said softly. He nodded, even though his legs felt weak. He walked to the side of the stage, and as the announcer called his number, he stepped into the light. For a second, the brightness blinded him. The stage felt bigger than he expected, and the audience seemed larger than he imagined. Rows of people, some leaning forward, some whispering, others scrolling on their phones. He wondered how many of them had already made up their mind about him. He had learned long ago that people judged fast. They saw his old clothes, his quiet way of walking, the nervous way he held himself, and they assumed he had nothing to offer. He felt their eyes on him the moment he appeared. A few soft chuckles rolled through the front rows, the kind people let out when they expect a performance to be amusing for the wrong reasons. But he didn't blame them. They weren't being cruel. They just didn't know him. The judges sat behind a long table. One of them whispered something to the other and smiled. Not a mean smile, just a doubtful one. The kind adults made when they assumed a kid was about to struggle. He had seen that look many times at school, at events, even at shops when he tried to count change too slowly. He walked toward the piano placed at the center of the stage. It was a beautiful instrument, polished and shining under the lights. It looked nothing like the broken keyboard he had at home. That one had 3 keys that never worked and a long crack across one side. But he had still loved it. He had spent years with that broken keyboard, teaching himself note by note, sound by sound. He stared at the piano now, feeling both excited and scared. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, just to sit at a real piano, to feel the weight of real keys beneath his fingers. But now that he was here, the fear was louder than the excitement. He took a deep breath and sat down. The seat felt cold under him. The microphone near the piano picked up the tiny sound of him swallowing nervously. A soft laugh came from somewhere in the back rows. He placed his fingers gently on the keys. For a moment he didn't move. He closed his eyes, trying to block everything out. The lights, the whispers, the uncertain looks. He reminded himself why he was here. It wasn't for trophies. It wasn't for attention. It wasn't even for applause. He was here because music had saved him more times than anyone knew. He remembered the nights at home when things were loud, uncomfortable or sad, and he would sit with his broken keyboard, pressing the keys over and over. Sometimes he played to forget. Sometimes he played to feel less alone. Sometimes he played because he believed, deep down, that if he kept going, something would change one day. Maybe not his life, but maybe his world. The judge closest to him cleared her throat, maybe trying to signal him to begin. He opened his eyes, took another breath, and let his fingers move. The first note echoed softly across the hall. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was clean, precise, and full of something no one expected. From the first moment, the atmosphere shifted just a little. People who had been talking suddenly quieted. Someone who had just looked down at their phone paused and looked up. Even the judges, who had leaned back in their chairs, slowly sat more upright. He didn't see any of it. He didn't need to. Once he started playing, the world around him disappeared. He wasn't on a stage anymore, and he wasn't a kid people underestimated. He became the version of himself he always wished others saw, the one who understood music in a way he couldn't explain with words. His fingers danced across the keys, not with the confidence of a trained professional, but with the sincerity of someone who had poured his entire heart into something no one else saw. Every note felt like a small story. Every melody felt like a memory being unfolded. The audience leaned in closer as the song built slowly. The boy's shoulders loosened. His breathing steadied. For the first time that night, he felt like he belonged exactly where he was. He remembered how he had practiced this piece thousands of times in his small room. How he sometimes played it so quietly that no one else in the house could hear. How he sometimes played it loud enough to drown out the noise outside his door. How he sometimes played it just to remind himself he was capable of something. Now that same piece flowed out of him naturally, filling the hall like a warm light. He didn't know what the audience felt, but he knew what he felt. Freedom. He played through the middle section smoothly, letting the notes rise gently. His fingers moved faster in the next part, but he didn't rush. He let the music guide him. The melody shifted from soft to strong, from sorrowful to hopeful. It carried the story of his life. Quiet beginnings, hidden struggles, small victories, and the dream he held tightly inside. When he reached the final part of the piece, he slowed down again. He played each note carefully, letting it linger in the air. The last note held for a long second, floating in the silence that followed. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands off the keys. He didn't look up at first. He didn't want to break the moment too quickly. His heart was beating fast, but not from fear anymore. From something else, something he had never felt on this level before. He finally turned his head toward the audience, expecting a few claps, maybe a polite nod from the judges. But he didn't expect what he saw. The room was silent, completely silent. Not a single whisper, not a single laugh. Every eye was on him, and for the first time in his life, those eyes weren't full of doubt. They were full of awe. He sat still, surprised, as if waiting to make sure it was real. Then suddenly someone clapped. Then another. Then a whole wave of applause rose so quickly it startled him. He blinked, confused, overwhelmed, unsure how to react. He had never heard people clap for him like that. He had never seen people look at him that way. And even though he didn't smile right away, something inside him opened, like a small door he had kept closed for a long time. He finally lifted his head a little higher. The world hadn't changed completely, but something had, and he knew this was just the beginning. The boy walked off the stage, his hands still slightly trembling. Backstage, the other kids were congratulating each other, hugging their friends or teachers. Some smiled at him politely, but most didn't know what to say. He felt a strange mix of pride and fear. Pride because he had finally played, and fear because he wasn't used to this kind of attention. For a moment, he just stood against the wall, letting the applause still echo in his ears from the audience. He thought about the old keyboard at home. It was missing keys, and the sound was rough and uneven, but it had been his teacher, his friend, and his escape. He had spent countless nights alone, pressing each key over and over, listening to songs from videos at a friend's house. That keyboard had been broken, but it had taught him patience and persistence. Every mistake he made, every wrong note, had pushed him to try again until he could play something beautiful, even if it was just in his small room. He remembered the first time he tried to play a song all by himself. It was a simple melody, but he had failed over and over. His fingers didn't move right, and the notes didn't sound anything like he had imagined. He felt frustrated, angry, and sometimes ready to give up. But he didn't. Something inside him refused to quit. It told him that if he kept practicing, if he kept trying, one day he would be able to make the music sound the way he wanted. The boy's life outside of music had never been easy. At home, there were always sounds of tension, arguments that he couldn't stop, and worries that pressed heavily on everyone. Money was tight, and sometimes even meals weren't certain. School wasn't easy either. Kids would notice his old clothes, his quiet nature, and sometimes they would tease him. Teachers were kind, but they had so many students that no one could give him the attention he needed. Music had been the one place where he felt safe, where he felt capable, and where he felt like he mattered. Every evening, after finishing homework and chores, he would sit at his keyboard. He would close his eyes and imagine a piano in front of him, even if it wasn't real. He would play notes slowly, trying to make them sound right, trying to remember the songs he had heard. Sometimes he played for hours without anyone noticing. He didn't need an audience. He only needed the music to remind him that he could do something remarkable with his own two hands. The boy had learned more than just notes and songs. He had learned discipline and patience. He had learned that even when life was unfair, even when people didn't believe in you, you could still keep going. Every wrong note taught him a lesson. Every moment of doubt became a chance to get stronger. Music had taught him resilience, and resilience had taught him hope. When he was invited to the talent show, it felt surreal. He had never imagined stepping onto a stage in front of so many people. The idea of an audience, judges, and lights was exciting but terrifying. For weeks, he practiced the piece for the competition in secret. He didn't tell anyone. If he failed, no one would laugh at him publicly. If he succeeded, maybe someone would see what he had worked for. In the nights leading up to the show, he practiced at a neighbor's house. They had a real piano, and he would sit there quietly after school until the evening, playing the notes as best as he could. Sometimes his hands hurt, sometimes his fingers bled a little from pressing too hard or moving too fast. But he never stopped. He learned to play not for applause, not for recognition, but because it gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt anywhere else. His family didn't understand why he loved the piano so much. They cared, of course, and they wanted him to be happy, but they didn't have the time or the money to help him with lessons. They worked hard, sometimes 2 jobs each, just to keep food on the table. They worried about him in other ways and often asked him to help with chores or younger siblings. Music was his own world, separate from all those worries. It was his secret place where he could feel safe and strong. The talent show was more than a chance to perform. It was a test, a small window into what the world could see if he was brave enough to show them. He had spent years preparing, even if no one knew. And now, stepping on that stage, even though the audience had doubted him, even though the judges had their expectations, he felt ready. Not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he had already given himself the courage to try. After the performance, he walked back behind the curtain, feeling an unfamiliar weight in his chest. The applause had been loud, yes, but the feeling inside was different. It was like he had unlocked a new door, one that showed him what was possible. He had proven to himself that all the practice, the nights alone, the struggles he had faced, they were all worth it. Music had given him more than skill. It had given him confidence, belief, and a sense that he belonged in the world, no matter what anyone else thought. The boy knew that this was only the beginning. There were more performances to play, more stages to step on, and more people to touch with his music. But for the first time, he felt like he had made the first step toward a future where he could be seen and heard for who he truly was. The small, poor boy who everyone overlooked could play music that moved hearts. And that was something no one could take away from him. As he waited for the next act to finish, he watched the other kids performing. Some played instruments, some sang, some danced. They had practice too, of course, but he noticed something about himself that was different. He didn't just practice to be good. He practiced to survive, to grow, to express feelings that words could not capture. Music had become his language, his voice, and his way of making sense of a world that often felt confusing and harsh. And as the crowd waited for the next contestant, the boy smiled softly to himself. It was a quiet smile, not for anyone else, but for him. He had faced the stage, faced the audience, and faced his own fear. And in doing so, he had discovered something far more important than applause or awards. He had discovered that even in the hardest moments, when life seemed heavy and uncertain, there was something powerful he could carry with him. His music, his determination, and his unshakable belief in himself. The boy returned home after the talent show, carrying a feeling he had never felt before. His parents were waiting, tired from work, but they noticed something different in him. He wasn't just the quiet boy who tiptoed around the house, careful not to make noise or trouble. He had a spark in his eyes, a small glow that told them something had changed. They asked how it went, expecting a simple answer, but he only smiled faintly and shook his head. Words were too small to describe what had happened. At school the next day, the boy noticed the whispers. He walked down the hallway, and kids who had ignored him before now watched curiously. Some gave small nods or smiles, and a few even said, "Hey, that was really good yesterday." He didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to praise, and he certainly wasn't used to attention. The boy walked on, letting the words wash over him without letting them get too close. He knew this wasn't about being popular. It was about music, about showing that what he had worked for mattered. That night, he sat at his small, broken keyboard at home. Felt different now. He had played a real piano on a stage, and the memory of it lingered. Every key on his keyboard felt familiar, but somehow heavier, like it was carrying the weight of what he had just done. He pressed a note slowly, remembering the feel of the stage piano under his fingers. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't sound like the concert piano, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that he had started from somewhere, and that somewhere had led to here. He thought back to all the nights he had spent practicing in secret. The small room, the broken keyboard, the faint light from a single lamp, and the quiet hum of the world outside. He remembered the times he had played to forget arguments or sadness, the times he had played to feel safe, the times he had played just because he believed he could. All those nights had been his preparation, even if no one else knew it. And now, standing on that stage, they had paid off. The next few weeks were a blur of attention and new opportunities. Videos of his performance had spread online, shared by the audience members who had been amazed. People from other towns, other countries, were watching and leaving comments. They called him talented, gifted, and beyond his years. The boy didn't know how to feel about this. It was overwhelming, and sometimes he felt uncomfortable with the sudden recognition. But he also felt proud. Proud that all his hard work had been noticed, even if it was just a small part of the world. His family noticed a change too. His parents seemed more relaxed, and his younger siblings looked at him with a mix of admiration and curiosity. They asked him to play for them at home, and for the first time he felt comfortable letting them hear what he had to offer. Music had always been private, his own secret world, but sharing it now felt different. It felt like opening a door and letting someone see a part of yourself that was usually hidden. School became a different kind of challenge. Some kids were supportive, but others were jealous or skeptical. They whispered, sometimes rude comments slipped under their breath. The boy didn't react. He had learned to ignore things that didn't matter, to focus only on what made him better. Music was his focus, his anchor, and he refused to let small negativity pull him away from it. Instead, he practiced more, played more, and worked on improving the skill that had gotten him this far. He started composing his own pieces. At first, they were simple, small melodies that he would hum to himself. But gradually, they became more complex, full of emotion and detail. He would sit at his keyboard for hours, writing down the notes on paper, adjusting each one until it sounded exactly the way he wanted. Sometimes he would play them for his parents, who would nod and smile, proud but never fully understanding how deep the music really went. The boy didn't mind. He played for himself first and for the people who really listened second. There were also challenges he hadn't expected. Invitations to perform in other towns meant long bus rides, missing school, and new faces. Sometimes he felt nervous, sometimes tired, and sometimes he wondered if he could keep going. But each time he played, the fear melted away. He remembered the stage from the talent show, the silence that turned into applause, and he knew he could face whatever came next. Music had given him courage he didn't know he had. One evening, he was invited to a small music event at a local school auditorium. The stage was smaller than the talent show, the lights not as bright, and the audience not as large. Yet, the boy felt the same rush of nerves and excitement. As he sat at the piano, he thought about how far he had come, from a broken keyboard in a tiny room to playing for strangers who had never seen him before. He pressed the first key, and just like before, the room grew quiet. People listened, and for a few minutes, the boy felt weightless, lost in the sound he created. After the performance, a teacher approached him and asked if he wanted to join a special music program. They offered lessons, a chance to learn with other students who shared his passion, and guidance from real music teachers. The boy felt nervous again. He had never been taught formally, and the idea of being around students who had years of lessons intimidated him. But he also felt something else. A spark of hope, the belief that he could grow even more. He accepted the offer quietly, feeling a small thrill of anticipation for what was coming next. Over the following months, his life changed slowly but surely. He still had his small room at home and his broken keyboard, but now he also had lessons, a new way to practice, and more people believing in him. He balanced school, family responsibilities, and music, learning discipline and time management. His parents were proud, but they never pushed him. They let him grow at his own pace, supporting him quietly in the background. The boy began to understand something important. Talent alone wasn't enough. Hard work, patience, and persistence mattered just as much. Every note he played, every piece he composed, every mistake he corrected was a step forward. Music was no longer just an escape. It was a way of expressing himself, a tool to connect with others, and a path to a future he hadn't dared to imagine before. Even with the recognition and new opportunities, he remained humble. He didn't play to show off or to compete. He played because it made him feel alive, because it gave him a voice when words failed, and because it reminded him of the journey he had taken to reach this point. His story wasn't about fame or applause. It was about the power of persistence, the importance of belief in oneself, and the quiet moments of practice that had shaped him. At home, he would sometimes sit in silence, pressing a single key over and over, remembering the first time he played alone. He thought about the small victories, the mistakes, and the lessons learned. Each night, as he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the echo of applause, the faces in the audience, and the warmth of recognition. But he knew that the real reward was not outside approval. It was the growth he had achieved and the music he had created. And so the boy continued. He played, he practiced, he learned, and he dreamed. Each day brought new challenges and new opportunities. He knew the path ahead would not always be easy, but he also knew that with music in his heart, with determination in his hands, and with the lessons of his journey behind him, he could face anything. Music had transformed him from a quiet boy into someone who could touch hearts, inspire others, and build a life filled with hope, persistence, and passion. The boy's next performance was in a larger hall, one that smelled of polish and echoes. The stage was wider, the piano grander, and the audience bigger than he had ever imagined. Even as he walked toward the instrument, he felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach. But this time it was different. The nerves were joined by a strange kind of excitement, a feeling that he was ready for whatever came next. He sat down at the piano, letting his fingers hover over the keys. The audience seemed endless, rows of faces stretching far into the distance. Some were young, some old, and many had cameras or phones waiting to capture a moment. The lights shone down, warm and bright, making the piano look like a treasure he had finally earned the right to touch. He breathed deeply, closing his eyes for a moment. The world around him disappeared, leaving only the music he wanted to share. The first note floated into the air, soft but confident. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The audience quieted immediately, sensing something special was about to happen. The boy's fingers moved with precision, yet with a kind of natural freedom that made every note feel alive. He didn't rush. He didn't play for applause. He played because the music was a part of him, a story he had been carrying for years, waiting to tell. As the melody grew, the boy felt a strange warmth in the room. People leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, mouths slightly open. They could hear the emotion in the notes, the feeling that each key pressed held a memory, a struggle, a hope. The music was not just sound. It was life, moving from the boy's fingers into the hearts of everyone listening. He remembered the nights spent alone with his broken keyboard, how he had learned to listen closely to every note, every pause, every rhythm. Those nights had taught him patience, focus, and the power of practice. Now, those lessons were paying off in a way he had never imagined. The stage was big, the audience large, but the music connected him to them in a quiet, invisible way. The boy felt the piece growing more intense, the notes faster, the rhythm stronger. It was the part he had practiced the most, the section that always tested his skill and endurance. He had spent hours perfecting it, repeating it until his fingers could move without thinking. And now, on this grand stage, it flowed effortlessly, as if the piano itself wanted to join in telling the story. He glanced briefly at the audience, catching the expressions of those in the front row. There were tears in some eyes, smiles in others, and a few faces frozen in surprise. None of them had expected such depth from someone who had appeared so small, so quiet, so ordinary. The boy didn't smile yet. He was too focused, too aware that the story he was telling was not over. The middle section of the piece was softer, slower. He allowed the music to breathe, to linger, to carry the emotion that had built up over the years. Every note was a message, a memory of struggle, a glimpse of hope, a reminder of perseverance. He could almost feel the hearts of the audience beating in time with his own. It was a strange, powerful connection, one that made him forget the size of the hall, the number of people watching, and even the lights shining down on him. Then came the climax, the part that would leave the strongest impression. His fingers moved quickly, yet carefully, creating a cascade of sound that filled every corner of the hall. The music swelled, carrying energy, strength, and joy. It was the moment he had imagined countless times, the moment where the notes themselves seemed to reach out and embrace everyone listening. The audience sat in stunned silence at first, then slowly, applause began to rise. The boy continued to play, letting the melody soar higher and higher. He didn't stop. He didn't glance at the judges or the crowd. He was in a world of his own making, where every note was a piece of his story, every chord a reflection of his journey. He had learned that music was not just about skill. It was about emotion, about the ability to speak without words, about connecting with people in a way that transcended language and age. As he approached the final section, he slowed down slightly, allowing each note to resonate fully. He wanted the audience to feel every moment, every pause, every breath. When the last note finally hung in the air, there was a heartbeat of silence, as if the hall itself was holding its breath, unsure if it could release the magic it had just witnessed. Then, the applause erupted. It was not just polite or expected applause. It was overwhelming, emotional, and loud. People stood, clapping, cheering, and some even cried. The boy sat still for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He had played with everything he had, and the audience had felt it. The connection was real, undeniable, and beautiful. For the first time, he allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't about pride or recognition. It was about knowing that he had shared something meaningful, something that could touch hearts, something that was entirely his own. The boy had always known that music was powerful, but now he understood just how far its reach could go. After the performance, the judges approached him with glowing expressions. They asked questions about his training, his inspirations, and his future plans. He answered softly, honestly, explaining how he had taught himself and practiced for years with limited resources. The judges nodded in admiration, clearly impressed not only by his skill but by his determination and story. The audience lingered even after the performance, some waiting for a chance to meet him, some talking quietly among themselves about what they had just witnessed. The boy walked off the stage, feeling light yet grounded. He knew that this performance was not the end. It was a step, a milestone, and a reminder of everything he had achieved so far. Backstage, the boy reflected on his journey. He thought about the broken keyboard, the countless nights of practice, the small victories, and the setbacks. Each challenge had taught him something valuable: patience, resilience, focus, and hope. Music had been his teacher, his refuge, and now it was also his bridge to the world. he realized that what made this performance special was not just the notes or the technique. It was the story behind the music, the years of effort, and the courage to show the world who he was. He had turned every hardship, every quiet moment, every failure into something beautiful, and now others could see it too. The boy knew that more stages would come, more audiences, more opportunities to share his music. But he also knew that no matter where he went, the essence of his journey would remain the same. The music he created was a reflection of his life, his struggles, and his dreams. And as long as he continued to play with heart and dedication, it would continue to touch people in ways words could never describe. That night, as he left the hall, he felt a quiet satisfaction. Not for fame, not for recognition, but for the simple, powerful truth that he had shared a piece of himself. He had played music that carried his story, and in return the world had listened, understood, and felt. And that, he realized, was the greatest reward of all. After his performance in the large hall, the boy's life began to change in ways he could barely imagine. Invitations to perform in other towns arrived, along with opportunities to meet experienced music teachers who wanted to mentor him. At first, he felt nervous. The attention, the travel, the thought of performing in front of strangers, it was overwhelming. But he remembered the first stage he had ever stepped on, the nervous trembling of his hands, and how he had found strength in the music itself. That memory gave him courage. The first invitation was to a nearby city for a small concert. The boy traveled with his parents, sitting quietly in the back of the car, thinking about what awaited him. He brought his music sheets, practiced in the hotel room, and tried to sleep, though excitement made it hard. When he arrived at the venue, it was larger than any he had seen, with rows of seats stretching far back and bright lights pointing toward the stage. The piano was waiting, polished and shining, and he felt the familiar flutter in his stomach. When it was his turn, he walked onto the stage and sat down. He looked out at the audience, many of whom had heard of him through the online video of his talent show. Some faces were eager, some curious, some skeptical. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and let his fingers find the keys. The first note filled the room, soft but clear, and the audience leaned in, quiet and expectant. As he played, the melody grew, carrying emotion and life, just as it had before. Each note was a reflection of years of practice, struggle, and hope. After the performance, people came up to him, congratulating him, asking questions, and even asking for advice on music. For the first time, he felt that the music he had poured his heart into was reaching beyond just himself. It connected him with people who had never met him, who didn't know his struggles, yet who could feel the emotion and dedication behind each note. He realized that music was more than sound. It was a way to communicate, to touch lives, to inspire others. Back home, he continued to practice diligently. His broken keyboard was still in his room, a reminder of where he had started. The new lessons he had received from experienced teachers added structure to his playing, helping him improve technique and understand more complex compositions. But he never lost the feeling that had made him special in the first place. The emotion, the heart, the way he let music tell his story. He knew that skill alone was not enough. Passion and sincerity were what truly made the music move people. The boy's family watched with pride as he grew. They had always believed in him, even when circumstances were difficult, and now they could see the fruits of his perseverance. They supported him quietly, letting him follow his path without pressure, celebrating his achievements with smiles, hugs, and simple words of encouragement. Their belief in him had been constant, a steady presence that helped him continue even when doubt crept in. School life remained a balance of normal responsibilities and his growing musical commitments. Some classmates were supportive, others envious, but he had learned to stay focused on what mattered. He didn't perform to gain approval or compete. He performed because it was his way of expressing himself, his way of making sense of the world, and his way of showing that dedication and hard work could overcome obstacles. Each performance, each lesson, each practice session became a step forward on a journey he had chosen and shaped for himself. One day, he received an invitation to perform at a national-level youth music competition. The thought of performing in front of such a large, prestigious audience made his heart race. But he accepted. He prepared meticulously, practicing for hours, refining every piece, perfecting every note, and imagining himself on the stage, letting the music carry him. When the day arrived, he stepped onto the stage, a little nervous but ready. The hall was enormous, filled with families, students, and teachers, all waiting to hear something extraordinary. As he played, he felt the familiar connection with the music and the audience. The notes flowed naturally, each one telling a story of struggle, growth, hope, and resilience. The audience was captivated. Some closed their eyes to feel the music more deeply, others smiled and leaned forward, and many whispered in amazement. The boy's playing was not just a performance. It was an experience, an emotional journey that transported everyone in the room. When the final note hung in the air, the silence was almost tangible, followed by a wave of applause so strong that it seemed to shake the walls. The judges were impressed beyond words. They praised his technical skill, emotional depth, and the story behind the music. Cameras flashed, interviews were requested, and invitations to perform at more events came pouring in. The boy felt overwhelmed, but in a good way. He had started as a quiet, unnoticed child, and now people were truly seeing him for his talent, dedication, and heart. Despite the growing attention, he remained humble. He continued practicing, learning, and composing new pieces. He experimented with different styles, blending emotions and sounds in ways that reflected his journey and his experiences. He became a mentor to other young musicians, sharing tips and encouragement, remembering how it felt to be a beginner, to be overlooked, and to feel uncertain about the future. He wanted others to know that talent could flourish if nurtured with patience, practice, and passion. His story inspired many. People shared his journey online, highlighting how a boy from a modest background had achieved so much through dedication and self-belief. Teachers, students, and musicians reached out to him, asking about his methods, his inspiration, and his philosophy. The boy realized that his journey had become more than personal success. It had become a message to others. It was proof that determination, practice, and resilience could overcome obstacles, and that dreams were achievable even when circumstances were difficult. At home, he continued to cherish the small moments, practicing quietly on his broken keyboard, composing in his notebook, or playing for his family. He never forgot the nights spent alone, the quiet practice sessions, or the obstacles he had faced. They were the foundation of his growth and the reason his music had depth and sincerity. He knew that true success wasn't measured by applause or recognition alone. It was measured by the ability to stay true to oneself and the journey that led there. As opportunities continued to grow, the boy remained focused on his passion. He performed in cities, schools, and music events, each time connecting with audiences in a personal way. The experience taught him that music could inspire, heal, and unite people. It taught him that hard work, perseverance, and sincerity could turn dreams into reality. He had started as a quiet, overlooked child, and through dedication, practice, and heart, he had become a young musician capable of touching lives and shaping a future full of promise. In the quiet moments, after applause faded and lights dimmed, the boy often reflected on his journey. From the broken keyboard to the grand stage, every step had been a lesson in patience, resilience, and hope. Every struggle, every practice, every small victory had contributed to the music he played. And every performance was not just about him. It was about sharing a story, a piece of life, and a message that anyone, no matter their background, could rise and shine if they believed and worked hard. Through it all, the boy learned that music was not just an instrument or notes on a page. It was life itself, with its challenges, triumphs, fears, and joys. And as he continued to play, perform, and inspire, he carried the understanding that his journey had the power to reach beyond himself, to touch hearts, and to remind the world that determination, courage, and passion could create beauty beyond imagination.